Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law. So welcome to another episode of International Law Behind the Headlines. I'm Cal Raustiala. I'll be your host today, and I'm really pleased to have with us as our special guest, Professor of International Maritime Law, James Kraska at the Naval War College. And I've invited James on the podcast to talk about the recent incident between Russian and Ukrainian vessels and to give us some perspective on how to understand the legalities behind what occurred. So, Professor Kraska, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I wondered if you could just kind of describe for us, first of all, what happened and tell us a little bit about the strait and, just kind of paint the picture of what occurred between these two between these two vessels, I should say.
Thank you very much, Cal. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you today about this incident that occurred on November 25th. So on that day, there were 3 vessels that were part of the Ukrainian Navy. 2 were small artillery patrol craft, and then 1 was a tugboat. And there's a bit of a disagreement on the facts. Ukraine says that this incident occurred outside of the territorial waters of Ukraine, although in some respects it shouldn't matter. Russia says that it occurred inside the territorial waters of Ukraine, and this is Russian-occupied Crimea, part of Ukraine, and that the vessels did not comply with mandatory pilotage requirements for transit through the adjacent Kerch Strait. So the Kerch Strait separates Crimea from Russia, and since Crimea has been occupied by Russia since 2014. It's under Russian administration pursuant to a vote that was conducted by the majority Russian-speaking government and people in Crimea, although it's still lawfully part of Ukraine. The Kerch Strait separates these 2 areas, and it's a narrow body of water that feeds from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov. And there's plenty of legal disagreement to go around on the status of the straits, the legal regime that applies. And so there are a lot of layers of this onion that you can peel back.
And have there been previous incidents or episodes involving these 2 navies since the Russian occupation, or is this the first?
Well, this is the first in this area. This is the first in contemporary times. There have been legal disagreements, however, over the Kerch Strait. And in fact, Ukraine has filed a case under arbitration under Annex 7 of the Law of the Sea Convention, and the registry for that case is the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And the case concerns a bridge which has been constructed and is complete now. It was finished in July of 2018. And this bridge stretches from the Russian side to Russian-occupied Crimea, Ukraine. And the bridge presents a legal issue because it impedes the type of ships, the height or the draft of ships that can go through the strait. And so about 1/3 of Ukrainian cargo ships are now locked in the Sea of Azov because they cannot go underneath this bridge. And so that raises a question about impediment to freedom of navigation, regardless of what the status of the waterway is. So the waterway could be internal historic waters of Ukraine and Russia. The water could also present itself as a territorial sea in which innocent passage applies, or it could be considered a strait used for international navigation in which the navigational regime of transit passage applies. And there have been a number of incidents between Russian authorities and Ukrainian merchant ships that have been harassed or impeded, as well as incidents between Ukrainian fishing vessels and Russian authorities in the Sea of Azov and in the approaches to the Strait of the Kerch Strait.
And just to clarify, the only two nations that have access to the Sea of Azov are Russia and Ukraine. Is that correct?
Well, that's a point of disagreement. That would be correct if the Sea of Azov is indeed historic internal waters, which is what Ukraine and Russia have previously claimed in a pronouncement. But it's not solely up to them. Under customary international law, there's a three-part test for one or more states to claim historic internal waters. And that would be that the state or states have to have governed the area of the water space. They have to have done so for an extended period of time, because this is customary international law. And then third, that they have to have the acquiescence or the acceptance of other states, especially nearby states. And so it's unclear to me whether they would be able to meet that test. And the presumption is always against the states that are making that sort of claim.
And that's very helpful. Does their stipulation or their agreement that it is in fact historic internal waters predate the conflict between Ukraine and Russia?
It does. Yeah, so they agreed in the early 2000s that that would be the status. And no other country seemed to issue a démarche. So that augurs in favor of it being considered historic internal waters. But even though the Sea of Azov is small, it's not by the standards of a sea, it's not an insignificant body of water. It's 200 kilometers wide by at its longest stretch, probably 300 kilometers long. So it's on the order of maybe half the size of one of the Great Lakes.
I want to drill down on what exactly occurred and then pivot to how you have interpreted the proper legal framework. But just to put this in context, to go back to the bridge itself that you mentioned, which I know is important to the story, is it fair to say that the building of the bridge by Russia is part of Russia's general attempt to seize Crimea permanently and also to I don't want to say cripple Ukraine's ability to operate through that strait, but it was deliberately intended to make it difficult? Is that your view?
I think that's a fair assessment. The bridge is part of the campaign to make permanent the absorption of Crimea back into Russia, which is where it came from. So Russia has a historic argument and a cultural tie, indeed a historic dominance over Crimea. But of course, the way that they went about their sort of reabsorption of Crimea was unlawful under the UN Charter system and international law generally, and that's why it is under sanctions since 2014.
So let's turn to what. Sorry, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say that for the second part of what you were saying, it's not only absorbing Crimea and making it a permanent part of Russia. The bridge does serve that purpose. It also very much weakens the economy in western Ukraine on the Sea of Azov, where that part of the country that's very near an area controlled by Russian-backed separatists that are positioned in Donetsk. That area is dependent upon maritime trade through two major ports, Mariupol and Berdyansk. And now those ports have suffered a huge fall off in traffic, and that has been going on since 2014. And so that weakens the economy and just the autonomy. And it's sort of part of the idea of the gray zone conflict, which is to frustrate and weaken the opposing country.
Right, right. So let's turn to what actually occurred in this incident. So can you describe exactly what transpired, and then we'll talk a little more about how to understand and interpret it.
Sure. There's a bit of disagreement on the precise facts, but what we know is that somewhere along the approaches to the Kerch Strait, Ukraine says in international waters, Russia says in the territorial sea, and the other possibility is that it could have occurred in the Ukrainian territorial sea. So even if Russia is correct, it appears that it occurred on the Crimean side of the Kerch Strait, and so if that is the case, it would have been in Ukrainian territorial sea, which would have been an even more egregious violation. But for wherever it occurred, what happened is that these three vessels of the Ukrainian Navy made it known that they intended to transit the Kerch Strait, and Russia responded that they were under an obligation to take on a marine pilot. And so pilotage is something that is used in waterways that pose a special hazard to navigation, particularly narrow waterways. This particular waterway has 4 or 5 bends in the channel. The channel is all on the Ukrainian side, so it's a very narrow channel, and by benefit of geography, the Ukraine or the Crimean side is the best side to transit. And Russia has imposed this pilotage without any sort of authority from the International Maritime Organization or even from its neighboring state. And so the Ukrainian vessels did not comply, and there's disagreement on how they responded or whether they responded. And the Russians warned that they would shoot. The Ukrainian vessels continued to, in their view, exercise their right of navigation, either innocent passage or transit passage through the strait. And as a result, there were shots that were fired, and several Ukrainian sailors were injured, although apparently not seriously. But it resulted in all 3 vessels being arrested, as well as the individuals on board, and taken into Kerch, and they are currently still detained by Russian authorities.
This raises so many interesting questions, but just quickly, how I'm trying to put this in context in terms of previous incidents, if there are any, where 2 major navies exchanged shots in the last few decades, or even just the last decade. How common is this?
Well, it's not common, although there are incidents. There are incidents in the Strait of Hormuz, for example. So in this case, with Ukraine and Russia, it's not clear that shots were traded, but just that the Russians shot at the Ukrainians.
I see.
And stood down. There's right now off the coast of Yemen and in the Red Sea, Houthi rebels have actually used even greater force, and they've set oil tankers afire. They attacked a Saudi frigate. They attacked the USS Ponce, a U.S. warship. And in that case, the United States launched cruise missiles against those sites. So there have been a number of incidents, I guess, recently. There's a vessel, a high-speed vessel that the United States transferred to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, that was struck by Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. So it occurs on occasion, but it's before that, as far as a major naval conflict, you'd have to go back to the Falklands in the 1980s, or the what was called Operation Praying Mantis, that resulted in the oil platforms case between the United States and Iran.
And were the Ukrainian vessels, to your knowledge, transiting was it equivalent to a freedom of navigation operation, or were they legitimately getting somewhere they needed to go?
Well, I would say the two are not
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So I mean, they don't have to have a specific reason why they want to transit the strait. They want to go from one part of their country to another part of their country. And it's unclear whether they were doing it as a test. They weren't incredibly prepared, and it's unlikely, if that's the case, it's unlikely you'd probably send a tugboat if you were going to do that anyway. So it appears that they were making sort of a routine transit, and then they were seized by the Russian FSB, the Border Patrol.
Got it. So let's turn to how to understand this incident. So implicit in what you were saying a moment ago, and you compared to, let's say, the situation in Yemen, that's a situation of armed conflict of various kinds. There's obviously debate about how to characterize that as well. But what happened here is in a different context. I mean, there is certainly an ongoing conflict, one could say, continuing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, though it's you characterize it as gray zone, and I think that's probably a fair description. So what law do you see as applying best here? Is this a standard law of the sea situation? Is this a maritime dispute? Is it naval warfare? How would you best describe it?
So I think reasonable people can differ, and my Eagle Talk post brought out some of the other perspectives, and I think that those are credible perspectives. My view is that the Ukraine and Russia are involved in an international armed conflict and have been since 2014, and that in that case, that lex specialis regime trumps the law of the sea, mutatis mutandis, as far as the law of the sea applies in this situation. So if this were simply a normal peacetime situation, then clearly there's been a violation of the right of freedom of navigation through the strait. And that then raises the issue of what was the character, the legal character of those waters, as we've talked about. I believe that a better way to look at this, though, is that there is, in fact, a international armed conflict going on, and the law of naval warfare applies. And in that case, there's nothing from a jus in bello standpoint that Russia did unlawfully during the engagement. Indeed, because these two are belligerent parties to a conflict, Russia could conduct status-based targeting, and it could have sank these vessels. It could have used any force. Now, Russia would still have to comply with the other rules for the use of force, including proportionality and principles of humanity and that sort of thing, which I think they did here. Now, that doesn't mean that I want to be an apologist for Russia, because their invasion and their occupation, the invasion was unlawful. The occupation is neither lawful nor unlawful. It's just a condition. But the invasion was unlawful. It was in violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter of the United Nations. Furthermore, subsequent to this incident, Russia has announced that they are charging these 24 captured sailors as common criminals, which doesn't recognize their lawful and rightful status as prisoners of war, how they ought to be treated. Now, it's a little ironic, because if they were considered prisoners of war, then they would be immune from any sort of acts on the battlefield or in the battle space in this case, including non-compliance with the Russian orders and all the rest. And yet, both Ukraine and Russia have stated publicly that there's not an international armed conflict. Yet, Ukraine has suggested, at least if the translations are reliable, and they may not be, that the sailors ought to be let go, and or that they are prisoners of war.
Interesting. So the Russians, since they're not treating them as POWs and just as criminals in this case, seem to be acting inconsistently with the paradigm you're laying out. What have the Russians done, if anything, that is consistent with the paradigm you've laid out?
Well, the only thing they did that was consistent is capture the ships and the individuals, because they would be lawfully entitled to do so anywhere outside of a neutral state's territorial sea. So regardless of whether this occurred on the high seas, in Ukraine's territorial sea, or in Russia's territorial sea, it was a lawful attack against enemy forces. So that so much is okay as far as it goes in jus in bello. The problem that this raises is that there is a tendency for states that want to leverage the gray zone to weave in and out of peacetime and wartime paradigms or regimes. And in doing so, not only does it dispirit the other side that is always on the defensive and unable to effectively respond, but then it confuses the rest of the world too, so that you can't form an effective counter, and the aggressor is always sort of always in control of the narrative and of the facts.
Say a little more about when you use the phrase gray zone. What do you mean exactly, and how has Russia leveraged that in this particular incident?
Sure. Well, the gray zone actually emerged from the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force that was facing a encroachment of the Senkaku Islands by fleets of Chinese fishing vessels that are actually part of an organized maritime militia. And the fishing vessels are acting as individual commercial vessels, and yet they're also a tool or lever for the Chinese government, and they're supported by the China Coast Guard as well as the PLA Navy. And this is a hybrid sort of coercion that is short of a clearly articulated international armed conflict, but it's designed to change the facts and make gains in favor of the force by using methods that are both criminal, that are in a criminal law regime, as well as that suggest the regime of international armed conflict. And so it's a problem in that it places the state on the defense of unsure what is the most appropriate way to respond, especially with an interest when you're dealing with states like Russia and China that are very powerful and that are willing to use force. The states on the defense want to de-escalate, and so it puts them at a permanent disadvantage. There's a view that there's nothing, that the gray zone is sort of non-existent. That is, you're either in law enforcement or you are in a law of armed conflict or humanitarian law situation. And I think that that's accurate. But of course, it imposes a very uncomfortable political and legal decision by states that are affected by this hybrid type of coercion or attack of how to deal with it.
Well, that's really very interesting. Are there other examples outside of the ones you just gave that you can point to where you've seen this dynamic play out?
Sure. China in the South China Sea, again, using hundreds of fishing vessels that are under the orders eventually of the government. They're really state agents, but they're acting as individual fishing vessels. The actual invasion and even now the occupation of Crimea, as well as the areas that are controlled by Russian-backed insurgents in the Ukraine, were done by forces that did not have appropriate insignia, that did not comply in that respect with the laws of armed conflict or the Geneva Conventions. And so it raised questions about whether how you would deal with these. So this is the problem in the East China Sea and the South China Sea are the little blue men. The problem in Crimea and in the Ukraine are the little green men. Who in fact do these aggressors work for? Are they just individual activists, or are they agents of the state? I think in both cases they're agents of the state, but that's not a very welcome conclusion, because then you have to deal with those two very powerful states.
Well, James, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I hope in the future we can have you back on the podcast. But thank you so much for coming on, for talking with us about this, and we look forward to learning more.
Thank you, Cal. I look forward to it.
Sure. Take care.
Thank you.